Captain Sarah Chun pushed another stack of maintenance reports across her desk, the fluorescent lights humming overhead in the cramped administrative office. The morning sun streamed through dirty windows, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets that seemed to multiply each day. Her fingers drummed against the metal surface as voices drifted in from the hallway outside. Major Brooks' swagger echoed off the concrete walls as he approached with his usual entourage of pilots. His voice carried that familiar tone of condescension that had become as routine as morning coffee. "You know, Chun, if you ever want to see what real flying looks like, you should come watch us run drills today. We might even let you sit in the tower and take notes." Laughter erupted from his crew, the sound sharp and mocking. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the paperwork, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The irony burned in her chest like acid, but she had learned to swallow it down with practiced ease. Her hands remained steady as she signed off on another requisition form. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar situations in your own community where someone was underestimated based on first impressions. The afternoon heat shimmered off the tarmac as Sarah walked toward the mess hall, her boots clicking against the asphalt in measured steps. Fighter jets lined the runway like sleeping predators, their sleek forms gleaming under the desert sun. The familiar ache in her chest intensified as she watched ground crews performing pre-flight checks with the precision she remembered so well. Lieutenant Martinez fell into step beside her, his expression sympathetic. "Brooks is just showing off for the new transfers," he said quietly. "Do not let him get under your skin." Sarah nodded, appreciating his kindness even as frustration coiled tighter in her stomach. She had dealt with worse than Brooks during her deployments, but being trapped behind a desk while others took to the skies felt like a special kind of torture. Inside the mess hall, conversations buzzed around tables filled with flight crews discussing mission parameters and aircraft specifications. Sarah grabbed a tray and moved through the line, catching fragments of tactical discussions that made her fingers twitch with muscle memory. A group of pilots at a nearby table debated optimal attack angles for ground targets, their analysis flawed, but delivered with absolute confidence. She found an empty table in the corner and sat alone, methodically eating while her mind automatically calculated the corrections their strategies needed. The sound of jet engines warming up outside made her look toward the windows, watching as Brooks taxied past in his F-16. The briefing room buzzed with pre-mission energy as pilots studied aerial photographs and weather reports spread across metal tables. Sarah entered carrying a stack of updated intelligence reports, her footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. The conversations died to murmurs as she approached the front of the room where Major Brooks stood with his arms crossed. "Here comes our secretary with the paperwork," Brooks announced, his voice dripping with mock appreciation. "Make sure you get those copies to everyone, Chun. We would not want the real pilots to miss any important memos." His squadron erupted in snickers, their eyes following Sarah as she methodically distributed the reports without acknowledging the barb. Captain Rodriguez glanced at one of the tactical assessments and frowned. "These threat assessments seem off," he muttered, studying the enemy aircraft specifications. "The payload estimates do not match standard configurations for those airframes." Sarah paused beside his chair, her eyes scanning the document over his shoulder. The numbers were indeed wrong, dangerously so. "Actually," she said quietly, "those are older variants. The newer models carry twice that missile load and have upgraded radar systems." The room fell silent as every head turned toward her. Brooks' face darkened with irritation at being upstaged by someone he considered beneath notice. "How exactly would you know that, Chun?" he asked, his voice sharp with challenge. Sarah felt every eye in the briefing room boring into her as Brooks waited for her answer. The silence stretched taut like a wire about to snap. "I read the intelligence reports thoroughly," she replied evenly, keeping her voice neutral despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "It is my job to understand what I'm processing." Brooks stepped closer, his presence looming over her smaller frame. Reading reports and flying combat missions are two very different things. Chun, maybe stick to what you know best. He turned back to his pilots with dismissive authority, but Sarah caught the uncertainty flickering in Captain Rodriguez's eyes as he studied her face more carefully. The meeting continued with flight assignments and tactical discussions, but Sarah noticed how several pilots kept glancing in her direction. Her corrections had been too precise, too immediate for someone who simply read reports. Lieutenant Hayes whispered something to his wingman, both of them stealing looks at her as she gathered the empty folders. After the briefing ended and the pilots filed out for their pre-flight preparations, Rodriguez approached her near the door. "You seem pretty confident about those aircraft specifications," he said quietly. Most intelligence analysts would not catch those details so quickly. Sarah met his gaze steadily, weighing her words carefully. "Sometimes experience teaches you to notice things others might miss," she replied, then walked past him toward the administrative offices. The radar station erupted in controlled chaos as blips appeared on screens across the command center. Multiple bogies inbound from the northeast, Sergeant Williams called out, his voice cutting through the sudden tension. Air traffic control immediately began scrambling fighters while base personnel rushed to battle stations with practiced efficiency. Sarah looked up from her desk as alarms began wailing throughout the building. The sound triggered something deep in her muscle memory, a familiar surge of adrenaline that made her fingers tingle. She moved toward the communications center where officers coordinated the response, their voices sharp with urgency over crackling radios. Major Brooks' voice came through clearly as he led his squadron toward the intercept coordinates. "Control, Viper 1 is airborne with 4 birds. We have visual on the hostiles approaching from Vector 270. Sarah counted the enemy aircraft on the radar display, her trained eye immediately assessing their formation and likely attack patterns. The first engagement happened fast. Missile lock warnings screamed through the radio as enemy fighters engaged the defending squadron. Sarah watched the tactical display with growing alarm as 2 friendly contacts disappeared from the screen in rapid succession. Brooks' voice crackled with strain as he called for backup, but the remaining pilots were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "We're taking heavy casualties," he transmitted desperately. "Request immediate reinforcements." Colonel Davis burst into the command center with his uniform disheveled and sweat beading on his forehead. The tactical situation had deteriorated rapidly as more enemy aircraft joined the engagement. "We have lost 4 birds and 3 pilots are missing," he announced grimly. "The remaining squadron is running low on fuel and ammunition." Sarah stepped forward from her position near the communications bank, her heart pounding as she watched the disaster unfolding on multiple screens. "Sir, I can fly," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the chaos around them. Davis barely glanced in her direction, too focused on coordinating rescue operations for the down pilots. Brooks' surviving wingman transmitted through heavy static that they were being pursued by multiple hostiles and needed immediate extraction. The base had no more fighters ready for launch, with the backup squadron still 20 minutes out from a training exercise. Desperation crept into every voice as the situation spiraled beyond control. Sarah moved closer to the colonel, her military bearing automatically asserting itself. "Sir, I am qualified on the F-16, she repeated more forcefully. "I can provide air support for the rescue operation." Davis finally looked at her directly, his eyes narrowing with confusion and irritation. "Chun, this is not the time for fantasies. We need real pilots, not administrative personnel playing hero." His dismissal stung, but Sarah held her ground as enemy contacts moved closer to base airspace. The command center fell into stunned silence as another friendly contact vanished from the radar screen. Lieutenant Hayes' desperate voice crackled through the speakers, reporting that Major Brooks had been shot down and was missing in action. The remaining 2 pilots were damaged and barely maintaining altitude as they tried to reach base airspace. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest as she listened to the chaos. These were her fellow service members dying while she stood helplessly on the sidelines. She strode directly to Colonel Davis and placed herself squarely in his line of sight. "Sir, check my personnel file," she said with quiet intensity. "Captain Sarah Chun, call sign Phoenix. 147 combat hours over Afghanistan and Iraq." Davis blinked in confusion, his hand moving instinctively toward the computer terminal. The radar operator looked up from his screen with alarm as more hostile contacts appeared on the display. "Sir, we have 6 additional bandits inbound from the east. Estimated time to target is 12 minutes. The colonel's fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed Sarah personnel records. His face went pale as the information scrolled across the monitor. Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, 32 confirmed air-to-air kills. His eyes snapped back to Sarah with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. "How the hell are you pushing papers in my admin office, Captain?" "Recovery from a training accident," Sarah replied tersely as Colonel Davis stared at her personnel file in disbelief. "Light duty while my flight status was being reviewed." The bureaucratic process had kept her grounded for months while administrators processed paperwork that should have taken weeks. Davis' jaw clenched as he absorbed the magnitude of his mistake. The most decorated pilot on his base had been filing reports while his squadron got slaughtered. "Captain Chun," he said formally, "you are cleared for immediate combat operations. Get to the flight line now." Sarah was already moving before he finished speaking, her legs carrying her toward the door with purpose she had not felt in months. The hallway blurred past as she ran toward the hangar, her mind automatically shifting into pre-flight mode. Years of training and combat experience flooded back like muscle memory awakening from a deep sleep. The flight line buzzed with activity as ground crews prepared the last available F-16 for emergency launch. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson looked up in surprise as Sarah approached in her administrative uniform. "Ma'am, this bird is being prepped for the backup squadron," he called out uncertainly. "I am taking her up, Thompson," Sarah replied, grabbing a flight suit from the equipment locker. The chief recognized the authority in her voice and immediately began coordinating the pre-flight sequence. "Aircraft 471 is fueled and armed," he reported professionally. Sarah zipped up the flight suit with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the familiar motions of pre-flight preparation. The helmet felt like coming home as she secured it and ran through her mental checklist. Thompson and his crew worked with urgent precision, knowing that every second counted as enemy aircraft closed on their position. "Control, Phoenix requesting immediate takeoff clearance," she transmitted as she climbed into the cockpit. The instrument panel came alive under her touch, each switch and gauge responding to her experienced handling. Engine start was smooth and powerful, the turbofan spooling up with a satisfying roar that vibrated through her entire body. Tower cleared her for emergency departure as she taxied toward the runway. Through her canopy, she could see personnel throughout the base watching her with mixture of curiosity and desperation. Many of them had never seen her in anything but administrative uniform, and the sight of her in full flight gear created ripples of confusion and whispered conversations. "Phoenix, be advised you are solo against multiple hostiles," the controller warned through her headset. "Estimated 6 to 8 enemy fighters with advanced capabilities." Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her as she aligned with the runway centerline. "Roger that, Control. Phoenix is ready to engage." The afterburners kicked in with tremendous force, pressing her back into the ejection seat as the F-16 accelerated down the tarmac and lifted into the clear desert sky. The enemy formation appeared as tiny specks against the horizon, growing larger as Sarah climbed to intercept altitude. Her radar painted 8 hostile contacts in a tight defensive formation, exactly as she had predicted from the intelligence reports. Years of combat experience kicked in as she analyzed their positioning and flight patterns with cold precision. "Phoenix, you are outnumbered 8-1, the controller warned urgently. "Recommend you maintain distance and wait for backup." Sarah smiled grimly inside her helmet as she switched her weapons systems to active. The enemy pilots had made a critical error by bunching up their formation, creating the perfect opportunity for a skilled pilot to exploit. Negative control. Phoenix is engaging, she transmitted calmly. The lead enemy fighter spotted her approach and began turning to establish a firing solution. But Sarah had already anticipated the maneuver. She rolled inverted and pulled the F-16 into a steep dive, using gravity and surprise to build speed while positioning herself below their formation. The first AM-120 missile streaked away from her aircraft with a brilliant flash, tracking perfectly toward the trailing enemy fighter. The explosion lit up the sky as her target disintegrated in a ball of orange flame and debris. Enemy 2 is down, she reported matter-of-factly while immediately maneuvering for her next shot. The remaining hostiles scattered in confusion as they realized they were facing a far more dangerous opponent than expected. Sarah rolled hard left as cannon fire streaked past her canopy, the enemy pilots now fully aware they faced a deadly adversary. She pulled the F-16 into a vertical climb that would have blacked out most pilots, but her years of combat flying had conditioned her body to handle extreme forces with practiced ease. Two hostile fighters tried to bracket her position, approaching from opposite sides in a coordinated pincer movement. Sarah waited until the last possible moment before executing a knife-edge maneuver that sent her aircraft slicing between them like a blade. Her second missile found its target as one enemy pilot struggled to match her impossible turn rate. The command center watched in stunned silence as radar contacts disappeared one by one. Enemy 3 and 4 down, Sarah reported calmly while engaging her third and fourth targets simultaneously. She used the vertical plane to her advantage, climbing and diving with predatory grace that left the remaining enemies confused and defensive. Within 12 minutes, more explosions painted the sky with burning debris. The last two enemy fighters broke off their attack and fled toward the horizon, but Sarah was already pursuing with relentless efficiency. Fox 2, she called as her final missiles tracked the retreating aircraft. Both targets exploded in rapid succession, their wreckage tumbling toward the desert floor below. Control, Phoenix reports all hostiles eliminated. Request clearance to return to base. The first exercise separated the trainees into teams of 4 for urban warfare simulation. Morrison made sure to position himself as team leader while his cronies, Petty Officers Jackson and Rodriguez, flanked him like loyal guard dogs. The fourth member assigned to their team was Maria. "We need someone to carry extra ammo," Morrison declared, shoving a heavy pack toward her. "Think you can handle that? Or should we find you a lighter load?" Maria shouldered the pack without comment, adjusting the straps with practiced efficiency. The weight distribution felt familiar against her shoulders, triggering memories of mountain patrols in Afghanistan, where every ounce mattered between life and death. The simulation began in a mock Middle Eastern village constructed from shipping containers and plywood facades. Radio chatter crackled through their headsets as opposing teams maneuvered through narrow alleyways designed to test tactical thinking under pressure. Morrison pushed forward with reckless aggression, ignoring standard clearing procedures that Maria had memorized from real combat zones. Jackson and Rodriguez followed his lead like puppets, their movements telegraphing their positions to any competent observer. Maria hung back, analyzing sight lines and potential ambush points with the methodical precision of someone who had survived similar scenarios when the bullets were real. Her fingers traced patterns against her rifle stock, muscle memory from countless hours of training that extended far beyond military instruction. The first ambush came from elevated positions Morrison had failed to secure. Maria was already moving before the simulation rounds began flying.